Scram SHA-1 is one of the 5 mechanisms for authenticating to MongoDB as a client or user. It's also the default authentication mechanism for MongoDB. Scram SHA-1 is a client response mechanism for authentication. In the case of MongoDB, it's a username and password way to authenticate to MongoDB. Just remember that when we say Scram SHA-1, we're talking about authenticating via your username and password. Scram SHA-1 is an Internet Engineering Task Force standard. It defines best practice methods for implementation of challenge response mechanisms for authenticating users with passwords. I don't want to get into the nitty-gritty details of Scram SHA-1, but you can know that it will protect you from the following attacks. First, there's eavesdropping. This is where an attacker can read all the traffic exchanged between the client and the server. To protect against this, a client never sends their password as plain text over the network. Then we have replay. This is where an attacker can resend the client's valid responses to the server. This is mitigated because each authentication session is made up by unique random nonces, so that each protocol messages are only valid for a single session. Database compromise. This is where an attacker can read the contents of the server's persistent memory. Scram SHA-1 mitigates this by salting and iteratively hashing the passwords before storing them. With Scram SHA-1, an attacker is unable to pose as a server without the knowledge of a client's credentials, therefore completely mitigating the malicious server attack. MongoDB CR is another one of the 5 client or user authentication mechanisms supported by MongoDB. MongoDB CR is another challenge response authentication mechanism. It is also another username and password authentication mechanism. With the release of 3.0, Scram SHA-1 has effectively replaced MongoDB CR. This means that as of 3.0, MongoDB CR has been deprecated. You will only encounter MongoDB CR on versions of MongoDB older than 3.0, or on servers that were upgraded from a previous version to 3.0 or above. If you do encounter MongoDB CR in production, it is highly recommended that you upgrade to a version of MongoDB where Scram SHA-1 is supported, and that you then migrate those old users from MongoDB CR to Scram SHA-1. We'll have a lesson that walks you through this process later in the course. Another commonly used authentication mechanism by MongoDB is X509. X509 is a certificate-based authentication mechanism. It became an authentication option as of version 2.6. With X509, you're required to have a TLS connection. If you're using MongoDB 3.2.6 or greater, then your version of MongoDB is already compiled with TLS support. If it's not, then it's easy to compile a version that has TLS support included. LDAP is yet another authentication mechanism for client authentication with MongoDB. It stands for Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. It's important to note that LDAP support is only provided in the enterprise version of MongoDB. LDAP is a directory service protocol commonly used within companies. It provides a mechanism for accessing and maintaining distributed directory information. LDAP provides a mechanism for accessing and maintaining distributed directory information over a network. This protocol is thus frequently used by email and other programs to look up information from a server. With LDAP authentication support, users can authenticate to MongoDB using their LDAP credentials. This makes LDAP an external authentication mechanism. This means that the actual credentials used to authenticate the client are not stored directly in MongoDB. Kerberos is the last client authentication mechanism for MongoDB. It's important to note that, like LDAP, Kerberos authentication support is only provided in the enterprise version of MongoDB. Developed at MIT, Kerberos is an industry-standard authentication protocol for large client-server systems. Kerberos is widely accepted to be a very secure authentication mechanism. Kerberos differs from LDAP in that it was designed specifically for the purpose of authentication. LDAP, on the other hand, wasn't designed specifically for authentication, but rather for storing metadata about users in an organization. Like LDAP, Kerberos authentication support can authenticate a user to MongoDB using their Kerberos credentials. Again, this makes Kerberos an external authentication mechanism. This means that the actual credentials used to authenticate the client are not stored in MongoDB. Not only is it important to ensure that your clients can securely connect to MongoDB, but it's also important that the nodes in a replica set or sharded cluster are able to communicate securely. If your MongoDB replica set or sharded cluster spans multiple data centers or touches the internet in any way, it's very important that you enable internal authentication. However, even while most internal networks are considered to be secure, enabling internal authentication is still highly recommended in closed networks to prevent attacks where a network becomes compromised. MongoDB currently supports 2 internal authentication mechanisms. There's key file authentication, which uses Scram SHA-1, and X509 authentication. With key file authentication, the contents of your key file essentially act as a shared password between the members of your replica set or sharded cluster. The same key file must be present on each member that talks to one another. Because of this, it's highly important that you keep this file secure. The actual contents of your key file must be between 6 and 1024 characters and may only contain characters in the base64 character set. It's important to note that all whitespace characters are ignored, so my password and my password are effectively the same. X509 is another internal authentication mechanism, and it utilizes certificates to authenticate members to one another. While you can use the same certificate on all members, it is highly recommended that you issue a different certificate to each member. This way, if one of the certificates is compromised, you will only need to reissue and deploy that one certificate instead of having to update your entire cluster. Finally, it's important to note that whenever you enable internal authentication, either with X509 or with key file-based authentication, this automatically will enable client authentication.